Hey buddy, welcome to Shark Jets. I'm SkidVis. In this video, I'm going to show you how to debug and track errors that are happening on your Discord bot. First of all, make sure to like and subscribe. That's first, that's primary, do that. But second of all, you gotta have a working bot using DSharpPlus for this video to be helpful to you. If you don't have a bot that works, make sure to watch some of Dapper Dino's bot building videos because they are awesome. All right, so let's get to it without any further ado. Okay, so here we are in Visual Studio. And the first thing, of course, is to make sure that our bot is working. So I'm in my bot.cs file here. And if I hit the run button, it'll pop up the console. So we know it's running, and then my bot in particular fires a message off to my training channel to say that it's running, so you can see it's working just fine. So now we can go ahead and stop that again. Now in this section right here, we're creating the client configuration, and so the client will fire off different events, right? So when the client is ready, it will call onClientReady if you have one. If a message is created, it will call onMessageCreated if you have one. So you can just define different methods to run when different events fire. And so we're going to do the same thing but with our commands. So down here where we set up our commands, where we register our classes that have commands, we can do the same thing because it has events of its own. So if we come in here and type in commands dot, you'll see all these different things with the lightning symbol. That means it's an event. So if you click on this, you'll see we have an event handler, on command error, triggered whenever a command throws an exception. So that's actually the one we want. So we will go ahead and click that one, and then we need to tell it plus equals and then give it a method that we're going to create to handle that error. So I will create a method called onCommand. Okay, so I'm calling it onCommand error, and it's a good habit to get into that when you're handling an event, you start it with the word on so that you know that it's handling an event. Otherwise, what is command error, right? So if we see onCommand error, we know that there's an event called command error, and this fires on that error, on that event. So this is now complaining that we do not have a method that matches that. So let's generate the method. All right, so now we have the method down here. It is a task, just like all the other ones. I'm gonna make it an async task. And it has one parameter called command error event args, right? And so that means that whenever an error happens, it's going to throw in this argument, this parameter, just so that you can inspect it and see what the error is. So let's clear out this not implemented stuff. Okay, so when we're in this method, we're gonna just send a message whenever there's an error to a specific channel. So I'm going to just do that, just do an await client send message async. And this takes two parameters. The first one is going to be the channel that you are going to send the message to. Now I already have a variable called admin channel, which has the ID. It's a Discord channel. It contains the channel that I send all my admin messages to. So I did that up here up top. Up top. Let's see. No, I did that when the guild is found. So on finding the guild, here it is. I create a variable that contains that channel that I'm looking for, my admin channel. So we're just going to send a message to that. So it is called _admin channel. And then the next thing we pass is just a string, which is the message. An error has occurred. All right. Cool. So again, I declared that variable. That's a static variable. So up top here, you can see I have a variable called private static. That means that it'll exist the whole time. It's a Discord channel and it's called admin channel. And then when I have an event that I'm catching called guild available. Now the guild is your server. So when your server is up, guild available fires. So whenever that happens, we call on finding the guild. And there, the first thing I do is set that admin channel to the channel I have called training. So back into our error. Now we have this set up. Whenever there's a command error, because some commands fail silently. If something goes wrong, they just don't tell you. But every error will trigger this event. So if you have something here to deal with it, then it will fire. So just to drive that in, I have a commands file here that just has one simple command called test me. And all it does is it sends a message saying you are testing my patience. So let's go ahead and run this. And then we will just come in here and type in $test me. And there you see it is saying you are testing my patience. Now let's go ahead and add some kind of restriction so that this can only be run under a certain circumstance. So let's go ahead and put an attribute here. Require roles, yes. And then those can be role check mode.any. And then the role we want is ninja. I have a role called ninja. So now when I run this, if I have the ninja role, this should fire, this should send a message. If I don't have the ninja role, it should just fail. So let's try this again. All right, so try this, test me. All right, so that worked. Now let's see, do I have the ninja role? I do. Oops. So right there you can see I have the ninja role. So if I turn that off, now I no longer have the ninja role. So let's see what happens if I try it again. An error has occurred. So you see whenever, since I don't have that role, that command event on command error fired. It said something went wrong with the command and it put that message that I said an error has occurred. Now this is great, but it doesn't really tell you what's going on. So let's go ahead and change this message from just an error has occurred to something like e.exception.message. Oops, that's not a dot, that's a dot message. Okay, so now that's going to tell us what the error message is. That might provide a little more information. So let's run this again. All right, so let's try this again, test me. And there you can see it says one or more pre-execution checks failed. All right, but which execution test? What's an execution test? And so here's where debugging comes in, right? You need to get really good at finding what the errors mean. This is the first step. Now we know that an error occurred, whereas if we didn't have that method or that event, then we would just not see anything happen and we'd be like, what's going on? Why isn't this working? Is there something wrong with my code? Blah, 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 blah. So at least now we have an indicator saying, hey, yeah, something went wrong and we're catching that. But it's not really telling us way too much information. It's not telling us really enough. It just says a pre-execution check failed, but that could mean anything, I guess. So we got to get good at debugging. So let's go ahead and stop this again. Now we know that whenever there's an error, we're going to jump into this method and call this, right? So let's put a little breakpoint here. So whenever an error happens and this method gets called, we will stop execution of the bot and see what's going on when that error happens. So let's go ahead and run that again. Okay, so we'll go back in here and type in test me again. Boom, now we're in the breakpoint. We have stopped execution. Visual Studio is waiting for us to figure out what's wrong with our lives. So you can see here in this locals window, that there are different variables that are being held in memory for us right now. One of them is this, which is the bot, and the other one is E. As you can see, this command event error args E. So this has the error. This has everything that has to do with the error. So let's bring this up a little bit because it's going to be a lot of stuff. We open this up and we already have some information, right? You can see that E has a property called command, and it tells you right there which command failed, right? The command was test me. Cool. That helps us out a little bit. At least we know what command it was. The context is going to be your normal CTX, right? The one that we're used to using all the time. It's going to have the channel, the client, the command, anything that CTX would have, the member who executed the error, the message, all this stuff. It's just a standard CTX, so that's what the context is. That's not going to help us. But this next one here is the exception. So you can see right there it says one or more pre-execution checks failed. So if we open that up, this has a lot more information. So now we can be like, okay, what failed? And you know, again, this is going to have a lot of the same information. It's got the command, it's got the context, it's got data. But the one that we're really looking for outside of message, right? The message is going to tell us a brief description of what went wrong. But in this particular case, since it's a pre-execution checks failed, they provide us with something else here. There's a little list here. See how it says count equals 1. So we have a list of something called failed checks. All right. So we can go ahead and open that up. And as you can see, we have one thing in the list, because you could fail for many different reasons. You can fail because you don't have the right role or the right permission or the right, there's a lot of different require tags that you can put on there. So if it fails more than one, then this list will have more than one. But in our case, we're only failing because of this require roles attribute, right? So it's telling us that we don't have the right role. And if we open that up, we can just see the same stuff. We can see that the require roles attribute is not right. The role name that it's looking for is Ninja. So this is more than enough information than we need. All we really needed to know is which one of the failed checks failed. And it's the require roles one. So now that we know that, we can go ahead and tell them, hey, you don't have the right role to do that. So how do we do that? All right. The first thing we've got to do is figure out which kind of exception this was, right? So since it's got failed checks, then it's probably a failed check exception. So we can figure that out just coming back into here. Let's stop this real quick. And let's try and figure out what the exception is, right? So let's comment this out. We don't just want this message anymore, so we'll get rid of this breakpoint as well for now. Now we want to do an if statement because we want to check the exception. So we're going to type in if e.exception is, right? And that's going to compare the type of exception that it is. So let's see what we got if we type in exception. All right, so we have a lot of things here for exceptions. Oh, look at this, checks failed exception. So what does that say? Indicates that one or more checks for a given command have failed. All right, so that's what we want to know. We want to know if the error that happened is a checks failed exception. So we'll click that, and then we'll do something. Boom. All right, so now we can go ahead and put this error message back in here. Right, so now we'll only get an error message if it's failing an exception, or a checks failed exception. So we can come in here and say, you do not have permission for that. All right, so let's run it again and see what happens. Actually, let me do something else real quick. Let me stop that. outside of this, let me just throw just a general generic error message. Okay, so now if the exception that happens, if the error that happens is a checks failed exception, it'll come in here and it'll say you do not have permission for that. And then it'll come out here and say it's borked. If it's any other kind of error, it'll just say it's borked. So let's try that out. All right, so here we go test me. And you can see it says you do not have permission for that, and it says it's borked. This is going to give us this error message if it's a checks failed exception, but that doesn't tell us which checks failed, right? Like what if it was, how do we know what this was? So we can come in here now and we'll do another if statement, right? So we're gonna convert the error. Right now the exception is just a general exception, even though it's a checks failed exception, it still registers as a general exception. So we want to make sure to cast that up to make sure that it's the right kind of exception so that we can access the properties that belong to that exception. If that makes any sense. If not, here we go. So we're going to call this proper error, right? And it's just going to equal e.exception, but we're going to cast it up. We're going to just promote it basically. We're going to say you are a checks failed exception, right? Because if we don't do that, for instance, if we come over here and we know from that debugging that there's a thing called failed checks, right? So if we go e.exception, oops, e.exception, come on, man, dot failed checks, you can see nothing happens, right? Because a generic exception does not have that failed checks list. But when we convert it to a checks failed exception, now we can type in proper error dot failed checks, and so you can see now that it has that property that the general exception doesn't have. So we're going to need that. So let's come back in here and we'll do another if statement. And this time we're going to check if proper error dot failed checks, and then we'll just check the first one, right? In a real case, you probably want to go through the list and see what's in it other than this one error. But for our case, we're just going to check to see the first error that comes up in this failed checks. Is it a roles, oops, that's not what I want. A roles required, is it require, right? Because we know all the different requires that we can have, right? We can require an attribute, an owner attribute, permission attribute, but we are looking to see if this first error is require roles attribute, right? So if you wanted to just limit it to admins, you'd be checking to see if it's a require permissions attribute. If you were checking to see if a user has a role, you want to see this requires roles attribute. So now, if that first item in that list of failed checks is require roles, then we can just send another message, right? This time we want to send it probably to the channel where the message was sent, I guess. So we can do this. We can go ahead and say e.context.channel, and we can make this more specific. The role required to do that. Okay, so now see, now we're going to check to see if it's a role issue, and if it is, we'll send a message to that channel specifically saying you don't have the role required to do that. So let's run this again. Okay, now we'll come in here and we'll say test me again. And we get 3 messages, right? We get the one saying the generic, or the specific one that says you don't have the role for that. And then we have a more generic one for that if statement to see if it's a fails check exception. So you do not have permission for that. And then the general one that says an exception has happened, it's borked, right? So in here we wanna fine tune this. You know, we don't want to send all these messages unless it's a specific. You want to send a specific message. So you would clean this up and get rid of just these random messages just sitting here specifically with no specificity, and just say, you know, for instance, if you could say if it's a checks failed exception, then do everything in here. Otherwise, then just send the it's borked message, right? Cool. And then the same thing here. If it's the requires role issue, then within this message, otherwise, we will send a generic permissions message. Cool. Right, so if we run this again, you can come in here and type in test me, and now we should just get one message. I leveled up, but you see we got the you do not have the role required. And when I change that to use the client, so I can actually punch this in any room here. Let's just put it in C# for now, and do test me again. Right, so now it's putting the error message in whatever room I have issued that command. So let's delete that so people don't freak out. And delete that. Okay, so the important takeaway here is that this method will tell you everything you need to know, and you should always have this event captured. That way, if there's any error whatsoever, you can catch it and do something with it and figure out what it is. So it's important to just come in here, have something that you can break at, and then that way when there's an error, you can inspect it and try to figure out what's going on, what command is failing, what's the exception, what can you do to fix it. If it's something else, if it's a command that doesn't exist, for instance, let's try that. Let me just continue this. All right, so I'm gonna punch in a command that doesn't exist, right? So pizza taco. All right, so now it broke, right? And what do we got down here? We got an exception that says the specified command was not found. So now we can open that up, see what the command was, right? There was a command name called pizza taco. So you can keep a log of commands that people are trying. Maybe people are typoing your command a bunch, and you can track that error and say, okay, well, people are misspelling that a lot. Let me just make that an alias for the actual command so that if people misspell it, it still works. So there's a lot of information to be gleaned from this exception and this particular method. So I highly recommend you implement this and get better at debugging your errors. And there you have it, quick and easy, I hope. Now, I really recommend that you implement some of this in your Discord bot, because the documentation for DSharpPlus is not the best I've ever seen. So you're going to have to rely heavily on Visual Studio and the debugger to figure out what is wrong with your bot and how to deal with it. That debugger and that local section that shows you the exception is going to be your best friend. You can detect so many things and figure out how to solve your problems by using that. If you found this video helpful, which I hope you did, please make sure to like and subscribe so that I can keep making more videos and be happy in life, because that's all I need. So thanks again for watching. I'm still SkidVis. Peace out.